Hello, everyone. Today we are going to talk about the shadows of the prairie, the persistence of enslavement in early Illinois. The national story often begins with American slavery in 1619 on the Virginia coast, but the story of racial harm in Illinois begins somewhere else and somewhere earlier. In 1699, French colonial control reached this region. By 1720, the French had imported enslaved Africans from Saint Domingue, what we now call Haiti, to build a racialized labor system on this land. Jesuit missionaries were among the first to own enslaved people here, establishing a pattern of complicity that spread through every layer of colonial society. That system would outlast French rule, British rule, and colonial Virginian rule. And when Illinois finally became a state in 1818, it would inherit every piece of architecture that had been built before it. What you are looking at is the blueprint. Four interconnected systems, each one designed to reinforce the other, each one older than the state itself. This is the story of how the prairie became a site of bondage, and it begins with a deliberate economic decision made more than 300 years ago. The economic logic of enslavement was laid down nearly a century before Illinois became a state, not as an accident of frontier life, but as a deliberate system imported and engineered. In 1720, the French brought enslaved Africans from Saint Domingue directly into the Illinois country to anchor a racialized labor economy. A French census in 1726 recorded nearly a quarter of the region's population as West African or their descendants, enslaved and traded through the Caribbean. By 1752, black enslaved people made up approximately 30% of the Illinois country population, a clear majority of the labor force. This was the founding moment of a racially based labor system in this region, one that predated U.S. statehood, predated the Northwest Ordinance, and set a precedent that every colonial power to follow would inherit, expand, and protect. The architecture begins here, the legal, economic, and racial structures that no regime that followed would ever fully dismantle. And that architecture was immediately put to work in the most brutal places on this land. The labor system the French built was not abstract. It was put to work in specific places for specific economic purposes. In the southeast, in the salt marshes of Gallatin and Saline counties, enslaved African descendant and Native American people were forced to work the salt, feeding kitchens, preserving food, and generating enormous revenue for colonial empires far beyond this region. In the northwest, in the metallic lead-rich hills near present-day Galena, enslaved labor pulled ore from the earth, ore that supplied ammunition, tools, and trade networks across the entire continent. These were not exceptions to a frontier economy. They were the economy. The wealth of this land was extracted by black and native bodies and converted into capital for someone else. The harm was not a side effect of colonization. It was the engine that made colonization profitable. And that engine kept running regardless of which empire held the deed. When sovereignty shifted from one colonial power to the next, not one of them chose to shut it down. Sovereignty changed hands. Enslavement did not. From 1699 to 1763, the French established the racialized labor system, importing enslaved people, coding their status into law, and embedding bondage into the economic foundation of this region. From 1763 to 1784, the British and colonial Virginians inherited that system and intensified it, using enslaved labor to clear land and expand settlement across a widening territory. From 1784 to 1818, the United States took possession of the territory, and the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Three regimes, three flags, three separate opportunities to break from what had come before. None of them did. Each transfer of power was a moment of choice, and every single time the choice was continuation. Formal political change, no structural transformation. The people in power changed. The system beneath them did not. It is a pattern that Illinois would carry long past statehood. And when the law finally appeared to intervene, it came with a door left open. The Northwest Ordinance was supposed to end slavery in this territory. Congress wrote it explicitly, "There shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude." But good intentions written into law mean nothing without the power and the will to enforce them. The ordinance had no enforcement mechanism, and it included a clause that allowed slaveholders to capture and return freedom seekers, effectively legitimizing their property claims at the federal level, even while claiming to ban the practice. Governor Arthur St. Clair argued the ban only prohibited the future introduction of enslaved people. Anyone already in bondage, he said, remained in bondage. Then came the legal fiction that would define the next 3 decades: indentured servitude. Slaveholders reclassified enslaved black people as servants, binding them to labor contracts lasting as long as 90 years. Slavery renamed, freedom on paper, bondage in practice. This fiction required a full legal architecture to sustain it, and that architecture already had roots deeper than the law. Before Jim Crow, before sundown towns, before redlining, the legal framework for controlling black life was already embedded in the ground beneath this state. Territorial leaders borrowed directly from the French Code Noir and used it to restrict black movement, ban interracial marriage, and authorize severe punishments for resistance or escape. These are the roots. And roots do not stay buried. Those territorial codes became the formal Illinois Black Codes of 1819, and by 1853, Illinois passed a law prohibiting all African Americans from even entering the state. Each law that followed grew from the same soil, fed by the same foundational belief that black life was something to be controlled, contained, and exploited. Everything that followed, the disenfranchisement of black voters, school segregation, racial terror, housing dispossession, grows from this root system. The harm did not begin with statehood or the Civil War or Jim Crow. It began here, on this land, before the state of Illinois existed. The architecture it built is still standing, and the shadow it cast across the Prairie State has had an everlasting impact. Thank you for watching. If you found this information valuable, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue documenting these stories and making these resources accessible to a wider audience. We'll see you in the next video.